Our third and final reader for this evening is Ellen Datlow. Ellen Datlow has been editing science fiction, fantasy, and horror short fiction for 35 years and currently acquires short fiction for Tor.com. In addition, she has edited more than 60 anthologies, including the annual The Best Horror of the Year, Fearful Symmetries, and Nightmare Carnival. Her latest anthology, The Doll Collection, features original dark tales of dolls from an impressive list of best-selling and award-winning authors such as Joyce Carol Oates, Sean M. McGuire, and Jeffrey Ford. A new anthology, Monstrous, comes out in October of this year. Datlow has won multiple awards for her editing. She was named recipient of the 2007 Carl Edward Wagner Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Genre and honored with Life Achievement Awards by both the Horror Writers Association and the World Fantasy Convention. Please welcome Ellen Datlow.
I thank whoever decorated this lovely podium here with doll parts, my favorite bits. And I also urge you to take a look at the assemblages in the back of Doll Things by Lisa. They are really incredible. I'm going to read from the introduction to my anthology, and then a friend of mine who's a colleague and writer will have a discussion, I guess. Let's see if I can get the light. Dolls, perhaps more than any other object, demonstrate just how thin the line between love and fear, comfort and horror can be. They are objects of love and sources of reassurance for children, coveted prizes for collectors, sources of terror and horror in numerous movies, television shows, books, and stories. Dolls fire our collective imagination for better and, too often, for worse. From life-size dolls, the same height as the little girls who carry them, to dolls whose long hair can, quote-unquote, grow longer, to Barbie, they really did have them, and I cut hers. Unfortunately, it didn't grow back, yeah. To Barbie and her fashionable sisters, dolls do double duty as child's play and the focus of adult art and adult fear. Some dolls were never meant for children at all. Voodoo dolls, for example, are created as objects of transference and loci of power. Effigies of hated figures such as Guy Fawkes are created specifically in order to suffer violence. Shrunken heads were used for religious purposes and as trophies. And capitalization, real dolls, and anatomically correct life-size models of women are made for men who prefer their sexual partners lifeless and mute. I myself collect dolls, including three-faced dolls, dolls that, given a turn of the head, will show a baby sleeping, crying, or smiling, as long as you don't mind twisting your doll's neck. Doll heads, I collect doll heads and other doll parts. That physical collection has led to this collection of dark fantasy and horror stories of dolls and their worlds. And by the way, every time I tell people, yes, I have a new doll collection out, they say, oh, dog collection? I said, no, not dog, doll. Of course, I'm hardly the first to see the connection between dolls and terror. Evil dolls are practically a subgenre of horror fiction and film. 1936's The Devil Doll with Lionel Barrymore as a mastermind behind a set of murderous dolls. 1975's Trilogy of Terror, wherein Karen Black is menaced by a Zuni fetish doll based on the short story Prey by Richard Matheson. The 1976 William Goldman novel Magic, an example of the ever-popular evil ventriloquist dummy subset of doll horror. The 1960 Twilight Zone episode, The After Hours, in which mannequins long for lives of their own. And, of course, the Child's Play franchise featuring the homicidal Chucky, which first saw light in 1988. More recently, 2013 saw the release of The Conjuring featuring Annabelle, a possessed doll whose own spinoff was released in October 2014. With this venerable tradition in mind, when I approached writers about contributing to this anthology, I made one condition: no evil doll stories. While these writers could and did mind the uncanniness of dolls for all it's worth, I did not want to publish... I'm sorry, I was checking a typo. It's not a typo, it actually was right. I hate that. Oh, shoot, I think it is a typo. Anyway, damn it. I have to think about it. All right, oh no, I hate that. Anyway, I did not want to publish a collection of stories revolving around the cliche of the evil doll. Surely, I thought, there was horror and darkness to be found in the world of dolls beyond that well-trodden path. As you shall shortly see if you read the book, I was right. The dolls and doll-like creatures range from the once ubiquitous Kewpie dolls created by Rose O'Neill, which often were given away as prizes at carnivals and circuses, to a homemade monster created out of a repurposed Commander Kirk doll, to a Shirley Temple doll come upon hard times, to unique dolls and doll-like objects created from the imaginations of the contributors to punish or comfort humans or placate the inhuman. Sigmund Freud, in his 1919 essay, The Uncanny, noted that dolls were particularly uncanny, falling into the category of objects that look as though they should be alive but aren't. But he also suggested that uncanniness in general was a result of something familiar that should have been kept secret instead of being brought to light. The cognitive disjuncture produces that feeling of unease which we attribute to the uncanny. What do dolls bring to light? In these stories, what they so often highlight is a malevolence that lurks not in the dolls, which, after all, are only poor copies of ourselves, only objects at our mercy, but in the human beings who interact with them. Not horrific in themselves, but imbued with horrors by their owners or controllers. What the dolls in these stories often reveal is the evil within us, the evil that we try to keep hidden, but the dolls bring to light. Theories of uncanniness have been elaborated upon since Freud's time. The uncanny valley refers to a theory developed by robotics professor Masahiro Mori in 1970. It posits that objects with features that are human-like, that look and move almost but not quite like actual human beings, elicit visceral feelings of revulsion in many people. The valley in question refers to the change in our comfort with these objects. Our comfort level increases as the objects look more human until suddenly they look simultaneously too human and not quite human enough. And our comfort level drops off sharply, only to rise again on the other side of the valley when something appears and moves exactly like a human being. It is in this valley, the realm of the too human but not human enough, that dolls have taken up residence, and it is in this valley that 17 writers invite you to visit. So that's what the book is about, and it's 17 stories, original stories, and I'm not sure how this is going to work with Usman is going to we're going to have a discussion. Oh, you'll introduce him? Good, great.
So we're gonna welcome up now Usman T. Malik, who actually read at our November event last year. So if you guys actually want to come up here, we'll set you up right here on these stools. Bear with us for just a minute while we get this Q&A set up, which is kind of the thrust of this second part. So hang on just one second here.
All right, so Ellen, I've known Ellen for a couple of years, and we've done a couple of talks and Q&As. So we thought we'd do something a little bit different, more casual, rather than fixed questions.
I told him I didn't want to know the questions in advance.
So she doesn't know the questions. It's a total surprise. And then she's going to yell at me. So, Ellen, how did you go about editing and stories for the doll collection? I know you talked a little bit about the story, acquiring the collection. There's one particular story about Joyce Carol Oates you told me about the story that came to be in the collection.
Okay. Well, what I usually do, I'll give a fast, quick view of how you do an anthology. Basically, you come up with an idea. You try to ask some writers, if I sell the anthology, will you write a story for it? Now, some will say yes, some will say forget it, I don't have time. Well, get back to me when you sell it. So then you write up a proposal, send it to editors, or your agent does, depending on if you've worked with specific editors or not, and then you hope that someone will buy it. It took me about 2 or 3 years to sell this anthology, partly because I didn't have a good title. I just couldn't think of the right title, and without a good title, it's really hard to get a grip on how you want to push it and how the publisher will sell it. But one of the people I contacted was Joyce Carol Oates, who I've dealt with a lot. I've published her in Omni Magazine first, And then I've been publishing her over the years for various anthologies, and sometimes I use reprints, and sometimes I ask her for new stories. And she'll either say, no, if I have an idea, okay, I'll let you know, and often she won't get back to me. In this case, I mentioned the story, and in 2 days she came back with a story. Okay, now the anthology was not sold, and I told her, I haven't sold the anthology yet. She said, it's all right, I want to dedicate it to you because I wouldn't have written it otherwise. So I'm trying to sell the anthology for 2 years. A year after trying to sell it and not getting anywhere, I went back to Joyce and said, although it was someone was looking at it, but they were very slow and I didn't know if they were going to buy it. I went back to Joyce and I said, I really don't want to hold on to this because I don't know if it's when I'm going to sell the anthology and you really should just send it someplace else. He said, no, hold on to it. It's yours. And luckily, within about 3 months of that, I actually sold the anthology. So what you do once you do sell an anthology to a publisher, you figure out when it's due, and you have to think about if it's all original. I have to figure out how long is it going to take for 17, whatever amount of writers are going to be able to write a story, and then I have to edit all the stories, put them together in an order, and get it ready for production. So from the time that an anthology is actually bought to when it comes out could be 2 years. Because I will give my writers like 9 months to a year to write a story for me, and that's what happened. And then it takes a year for a big publisher to actually get it out and do the publicity and marketing and advance sales, blah, blah, blah. So it takes a while to do that. So that's basically how I did. And, so I asked the writers who I've worked with, who I think who I thought would be interested in doll stories to write stories for me. And one interesting thing is, one person who's in it is Richard Bowes, who's a gay writer who writes a lot for me. And he said he was shocked at how many men wrote stories for me, that he just thought it'd be all women. It's like, I don't know, I just asked people and they said yes.
So, I was remembering that Doug E. Winter quote that's attributed to him, that horror is not a genre, it's an emotion. What do you think about that? Is horror a genre at all?
Horror is many genres. Basically there's science fiction horror. There's anything can be considered horror. It's the tone. If something is dark enough, it doesn't matter what genre. If it's Western, I don't care if it's Western, mystery, crime, science fiction, or fantasy. If it's dark enough and has horrific elements, I'll often consider it horror. Because it's unlike science fiction and fantasy, and there aren't rules of what make horror exactly.
And you've taken several stories from literary markets over the years for the year's best, correct?
Oh, yeah. When I edit the best horror of the year, which means I try to read all the short stories published in a year, which is kind of difficult, but I try to, and I read a lot of literary magazines and journals, in addition to science fiction magazines and anthologies and single author collections. So I'm always looking all over the place. I've bought. In the past, when I was doing the year's best fantasy and horror, I bought stories from Esquire, George Saunders, Red Bow, I think, and I've published Dan Chown, reprints of his. He was published in...
You had Little America, I think, right?
Yeah, but he's been published in both literary and non-literary. I figure he had 2 really great horror stories out, Little America and another one. I don't remember which I took for the year's best, but I think one was in a literary magazine, the other was not. It might have been in... I think it was in a John Joseph Adams horror anthology.
Wasn't it Shadow Shows, the Ray Bradbury tribute? That Little America was. I think
maybe.
So, yeah.
Do you remember the title of that one?
I think it was Little America that you took.
Which was the other one?
I don't remember the other one.
Okay, all right. Anyway, I took one of the stories. So yeah, the only problem with taking literary, quote unquote, literary stories for an anthology is that if you deal with the author, that's great. But with a lot of literary writers you have to go through the agent, or you have to go through the book publisher. And if you go through a book publisher, you have to go to sub-rights, and they don't understand that I'm paying penny a word. That's what a reprint anthology, a best of the year, pays. And sub-rights people want like $1,000 for a story, and they don't care that it's a prestigious market as far as I'm concerned, and maybe the author likes that. So that's why. There'd be, I think, a lot more literary writers in genre reprint anthologies if we could get the rights.
Yeah, didn't you have trouble with the Karen Russell story that you were trying to acquire?
It wasn't their fault. What happened? Karen's Reeling for the Empire was brilliant. I mean, that was a couple of years ago. I think it was in Tin House. I'm not sure where it was. But the problem is it was a long story. It was a novelette, and I didn't commit to it till the end of the year. I mean, if I was going to say I wanted that story like in January for the next year, it probably would have been easier. She said, "Oh yeah, I'd love you to reprint that," but it's in my. And then it turns out I actually I had to contact the publisher in January or February of the next year, and her collection had come out. Once it's out in a collection, all bets are off, because that's when the sub-rights people control it. But, I mean, initially said, yeah, I'd really like you to do it. Here's my agent. And the agent said, well, you have to deal with the sub-rights people of the publisher. And the problem was they might have given me the rights, and they might have even only taken a penny a word, but they couldn't give me an immediate answer. It would have taken weeks, and I really had a deadline. So I might have gotten it if I tried months earlier. I just don't know.
Because that was one of the things you told our class when you were teaching Clarion. You said be very careful about rights to reprints for short story collections and short stories.
It's difficult. For literary writers, it's really difficult to maintain your rights to individual stories, because it seems like a lot of the the big name publishers like Random House and Frost Strauss insist on keeping those rights or taking those rights.
So I have a quick question, just a casual question.
Okay.
Why should anyone read horror at all?
Oh, don't ask.
Why bother?
I don't know. I love it. It puts you in your discomfort zone. It deals with things we may not want to talk about or face, like death. I mean, most horror is about death, and also loss of control. I mean, there are a lot of aspects to horror that, no, you may not want to deal with. But reading a horror story, if you're involved in it, it forces you to, well, hopefully any story you'll enjoy it. You'll get involved and you'll enjoy reading the story. I can't say why I love horror, but I do. I have to take this. I'm good. If anyone has a cough drop, I'd appreciate it. This is a peppermint. I'll try that.
So, many people, when they hear the word horror, they immediately think Stephen King. He's kind of the first name that comes to mind for many people when we talk about that. Is Stephen King's work all there is to horror? Is there more to that than that?
Here's a real cough drop, I think.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Of course.
I'm going to eat this one then.
Eat that.
Okay.
That's not a cough drop. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Stephen King writes all kinds of stuff. He doesn't write just horror. And I happen to like his short stories. Oh, wait a minute. I hope I don't get laryngitis suddenly. I love his short stories and novellas better than his novels. But of course he's not everything in horror. Joyce Carol Oates writes a lot of horror. Ray Bradbury wrote horror. I can't believe I'm losing my voice. How did this happen? Horror is broad, and horror, Hannibal Lecter is horror. Silence of the Lambs won the World Fantasy Award. Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it did. And there was, some people thought, oh no, how could it be? It's psychological. It's not fantasy. Why did it win? Well, it's a horror story, and it's a really powerful horror story. So that's what I love about horror, that it can be anything. It's a perception of the world. And actually, I have a lot of discussions about dark fantasy versus horror, like what's the difference? I mean, I don't even know how many people here read dark fantasy or think about this at all. Okay. Well, to me, the difference is dark fantasy usually has a more optimistic feel to the whole story. What I use as an example, some of you must read Richard Kadri's Sandman Slim novels. And to me, they're full of violence, they're horrific, they have horrible things happen, but they're not horror. And the reason they're not horror is because they're too much fun. No, seriously, horror is not fun. When you read a horror story, you come away with, I don't want to say depression, because I don't want to get depressed reading horror. I mean, there's bleak and there's other modes of...
I think you come away with dread more than anything else, don't you?
Definitely dread, yeah. And I mean, dark fantasy, you do not come away with the idea of the feeling of dread. With horror, you do. And it's just, to me, it's in the extreme. I mean, it goes further. To me, dark fantasy is lighter than horror.
So,
it's the reaction to it. But yeah, dread is definitely a very important factor in horror. And I don't think dark fantasy has that.
So if I were to ask you, because I know some of the people in the audience may or may not be familiar with contemporary modern horror writers, especially in short fiction. Would you care to name a few that you like, that people should seek out?
I'll mention some that you might have heard of who aren't known as horror writers. I mean, Brian Evanson's a literary writer who writes horror all the time. At least, I mean, most of his work is horror or science fiction. Joyce Carol Oates, as I said, she writes very good horror novels sometimes, but her horror short stories are really harrowing sometimes. Patrick McGraw, it looks like McGrath, but it's Patrick McGraw. And his novels are, most of them are horror. Spider, and the first one I ever read by him, I can't remember the name, but that's how I found him. Ian McEwan's early work was horror. Comfort of Strangers was a horror novel. And these are people who I started reading when I was at Omni, looking for writers I wanted to publish in Omni, some of whom I actually got. Like T. Corey Gesson Boyle, but Tom's stuff isn't really horror. It's weird, but I don't consider most of it horror. You know. But anyway, and then there were the people who are not strictly, I mean that's wrong, but people who are up and coming in horror who are very literary, but they're considered horror writers. Nathan Ballingrud, Laird Barron, John Langan, Caitlin Kiernan. Helen Marshall. Although I think you do more
Helen Marshall.
Helen's is actually more weird fiction and dark fantasy. Very little of your work slops over into horror, I think. So yeah, I mean, right now it's a golden age of horror short fiction, and not necessarily for markets, but for the actual work.
The actual work. So speaking of actual work, can you talk a little bit about women in horror today?
What about them?
Any women writers that we should seek out, or do you see a trend that are more women writing horror than you used to 30 years ago?
Okay, I've been editing a Year's Best Fantasy. When I did the Year's Best Fantasy in horror, I only did the horror part, and I co-edited that for 21 years. And during that time, by and large, most of the stories that I took were by men. And most of the stories in the fantasy part, which I did not edit, were by women. But in the last 5 years, now I do a best horror. The Year's Best Fantasy and Horror stopped a few years ago, and I've been editing a best horror of the year for 6 years. I just handed it number 6. And I'm finding in the last 3 or 4 years, I'm including a lot more women. And I'm not searching them out necessarily. I do think that more women are writing darker material right now.
Than they used to.
Yeah, I mean, I think women have always read horror, but I do think that it took a while for the newer women to get reputations. I mean, there are new writers, A.C. Wise. The thing is, a lot of the women writers write not only horror. I mean, there's a whole batch of new writers, not men and women, who are writing all over the genre. They don't care. Elizabeth Hand has been writing for years. She writes science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and occasionally mainstream. Kelly Link. I published Kelly in Event Horizon. I published her stories, The Specialist Hat and The Girl Detective there. That's where they were published first in an online magazine. And she writes science fiction, fantasy, and horror.
And she's pretty much
science fiction, only occasionally science fiction.
And she's pretty much a tin house presence now. She's an instructor.
Yeah. I mean, she's now a literary darling, but I mean, she will say she publishes horror.
Yeah.
You know, she's not embarrassed about it, and science fiction. So yeah, I mean, it's all over the place, and I think that's a good thing.
Do we have time for more questions? One more. Okay, all right. So one last question. You've been editing for about 30, 35 years, correct?
Short stories.
Stories.
I was in a miserable 5 years in book publishing, but yes.
What trends of themes are you seeing more or less addressed in the last 30 years? Where are we going? Where is horror moving towards?
Don't.
Last question. It had to be a.
Trends are awful. I cannot. Well, the fact that there are more women writers. I mean, not in what it's about. I mean, there are always certain subgenres that are popular. Okay, one example, though. 10 years ago, I thought I would never stand to read a zombie story again. It's like they're all the same. They're horrible. I can't bear it. And yet, every once in a while, there are brilliant zombie stories. I will never say never to a trope. I mean, everyone said I can't stand vampire stories. I can't stand werewolf stories. And yet, every once in a while, a brilliant novel or story comes out that's exactly that. I have a terrific zombie story by Stephen Graham Jones in Tour.com last year. And it's an academic zombie story.
Chapter 9?
6.
Chapter 6.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, as far as trends, I mean, zombies, and I'm not trying to pun, will never die. They'll keep, you know, they keep getting published. Lovecraft will never die. I mean, Lovecraft is more popular than ever. And I've always hated the pastiches, but I really appreciate the influence of Lovecraft. And I've done, so far, 2 Lovecraftian anthologies, one mostly original, Lovecraft Unbound, and one Lovecraft Monsters that was all mostly reprint. And they're Lovecraftian. They use the cosmic horror. I said no tentacles. Basically, Lovecraft without the tentacles and without the ichor. And there are some fabulous writers writing in that vein right now. And
I think you actually had a rule. You couldn't use the word eldritch.
Well, eldritch, ichor, yeah. There are a few tentacles in my story, but I try to get people to avoid them.
So,
do we have time to take questions?
Can we take questions, or?
No, we don't. You don't. It's up to you guys.
Okay. All right. So.
Only a few. You have to tell us when to shut down.
Okay. We can talk all night.
I know. I warned him.
A few days ago, 3 journalists were talking about the pillow Barbie.
The pillow Barbie?
Barbie that apparently uploads to the cloud. And so one guy was saying, well, this is terrible for young girls and whoever's playing with the Barbie, talking, interacting with it, interfacing with the Barbie that apparently can spawn back. But the other guy said, no. Developmentally, these girls at age 5, 6, they don't have it developmentally to be able to be disturbed by this interaction because their brains are not wired yet to be disturbed. What do you think of that?
I don't know. I have no idea. And what does the third scientist say? What did you say there were 3? Well, no, but you said there were 3. All right. Anyway, I have no idea. I'm trying to think of. I was not really that into dolls as a kid. I liked dolls, but I never was obsessed with them. And then at a certain point in my life, and I was an adult, I had to have been in my 20s or 30s when I started collecting doll parts and different types of dolls. But I don't remember them ever being creepy to me. I don't find dolls creepy. There's some that are disgusting looking. I judged a creepy doll contest in Santa Fe last week, and people brought their. You can see it online. There were 26 entries. You can see the pictures on Facebook. And the creepy versus horror. Okay, that's creepy versus icky. I did it with 2 of the contributors, and we judged them. And I thought there was a bunny. I forget, it was something bunny, and it was a bunny kind of doll, and it was chewing baby chicks. And I said, that's disgusting. To me, that's icky. It's not creepy. But we compromised, and it did win 3rd prize. But there's a difference. There was some that's disgusting. That's not creepy to me. It's like, and I'm not saying disgusting is bad, but there is a difference. There's a fine line. Yeah. Any question? Yeah.
I actually, a friend of mine who's in the audience, Ryan, and I were talking about monsters one time, and we were talking about, I don't remember exactly what we were referencing, but Ryan said that he found a lot of monsters that he was seeing in artistic design were interesting looking, but he didn't find them psychologically effective. And
effective means scary? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's psychologically imposing. They were physically imposing, not psychologically.
Right.
And that really stuck with me for a long time. So I was just curious, for you, what makes a monster psychologically?
I think it's point of view. I just finished an anthology called The Monstrous that's mostly reprint. And to me, the most monstrous, the stories were not about, I guess I wanted there to be monsters. I tried to avoid human monsters. I tried to say to people, no, I don't want human monsters, I want something else. And to me, the monster may be there, but it's everything. It's people's reaction to the monster. It's what the monster brings to the story, and the multi-layers of the monstrous, horrible things happening. The monster itself doesn't have to be scary at all. Ghosts. I don't know if you can hear me. I just realized I wasn't talking into the mic. Okay, all right. That's another thing about horror. Ghost stories don't have to be horror stories at all. I edited an anthology called The Dark, deliberately trying to commission stories that were dark. But there are a lot of ghost stories that are brilliant stories that are very moving and upsetting, but they're not horror. So that's the same thing with monster. It's what happens in the story that makes something monstrous or a monster. The Frankenstein's monster is only monstrous because Frankenstein fucked up. I mean, he didn't teach it anything. No, seriously. I mean, he let his child, he just screwed up his child and didn't care. And so the monster is pitiable. You know, it does all this stuff because it doesn't realize it's so strong. It doesn't know what to do. So, is it a monster? I mean, who says it's a monster? Yes, it ends up doing monstrous things, but is it its fault? No. So, yeah, there's a difference between what's scary and if a monster is scary or not. And it's not just the look. It's what that monster does, and why it does it. So it's very psychological. I don't know if that even answers the question. Unfortunately, we could talk about this all night, and I think we're not supposed to.
We can take one more question.
We can? Did
Yes.
you just say that? Okay. Someone in the back? Yeah.
Matt.
Ellen, would you consider extending the deadline for the story that Usman is writing for you?
Oh, God.
Which one is that? What story is that?
Oh.
What deadline? Oh, you mean in general? He's not writing a story for me.
So we're going to ignore that question. You had a question. You had a question right there.
Bad boy.
I started reading Year's Best Fantasy Horror when I was 11, and I read...
That makes me feel really old.
It makes me feel really old.
But I know it's a good...
My dad bought me one every year for Valentine's Day. It was sort of like...
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah. Until I was 18. And one of the stories that really has stayed with me, and I recommend it to friends all the time from all those years of reading the anthology, is Joyce Carol Oates' Martyrdom.
Oh, yeah.
I noticed recently you were the guest editor for Nightmare Magazine's issue Women Destroy Horror.
Right.
And that you reprinted that story for that issue. And I was wondering if you could just talk about how you guys decided to, how you became the editor for that issue and why you decided to reprint that.
All right. She's talking about Women Destroy Horror was part of a Kickstarter created by John Joseph Adams of Lightspeed Magazine, a webzine. And he wanted to... The first idea was, I'll try to make it brief, it was Women Destroy Science Fiction, and it was a satirical thing because men have periodically, or over the last 30 years, complained that women in science fiction have destroyed the genre. So anyway, they made a ton of money from the Kickstarter, and they said, with a stretch goal, they're going to do Women Destroy Fantasy. They made a ton of money for that. So I said, okay, we're going to do one with horror. And I don't remember at what point John asked, would I like to edit it? And he said, sure, if you pay me. So yeah, sure. And he did. I mean, we got the money. And the issue was going to be, I think, four original stories that I commissioned, or 3 or 4, I can't remember. One that came through the Slush. I don't read Slush anymore. I mean, coming up in the field, I read Slush for many years. But I don't read Slush anymore. I don't have the time or energy. But we had a slush pile for Women Destroy Horror, and various people read it and passed on stories to me, and I bought one of the Slush stories. So I think there were 5 originals and 3 or 4 reprints, and I wanted to give attention. And it was it would be all women issue, writing the stories, and I wanted classics that I thought weren't online, were by underappreciated writers or underappreciated stories, and which is what I often do with reprints anthologies. And I like Joyce's story. I remembered it from reprinting it in Year's Best Fantasy and Horror. Second story was A.R. Moreland, who's a writer who's totally very underappreciated. She's still on typewriter. She doesn't use a computer, so she has a hard time selling her stuff. But anyway, there was a story that I loved that I had used in one of my anthologies, and I took that. And who's the third one? Oh my God, I can't remember the other reprint. Oh, it'll come to me tonight in a few hours. Oh, Tanith Lee. And then also the stories were very different from each other. Joyce's was kind of about child abuse, more or less. I mean, to make it simple. AR's was about rock and roll and bad stuff, nasty rock and rollers. And the third one by, I think again, I'm like my brain. Tanith Lee was about falling birds, about this environmental disaster. So that's how I chose the And there's stories that I remember. You know, I mean, I don't start doing research and like start reading all these books. I mean, for that kind of situation, I mean, I've been reading stories for 35 years and reprinting them over and over. Basically, if I reprint a story like more than 3 times, it means I really, really love that story, and I'm trying to push it on people so they read it. So that's kind of how that came about.
And you had a couple of originals. You had Olivia Llewellyn story, too.
Olivia. Yeah, I had Olivia Llewellyn, who is a really great horror writer, short story writer, who I think everyone should read. She has a collection out, which I don't remember the title, but she's really good.
Is it Engines of Desire?
Yes, thank you. And so, yeah, we're good.
We're a good team.
Here. Who else was a Pat Cadigan had an original story. She's a fabulous science fiction, fantasy, and horror writer. And the one from the slush was a woman named Catherine Crichton, who I never heard of before, but who had published a few stories. And who wrote Sideshow? Oh, A.C. Wise? Oh, God, I'm terrible. I mixed up some of my authors. Was it? Oh, no, Gemma Files? No, Gemma Files wrote This Is Not For You. The vicious, and I took that for the year's batch.
That's the Woods story. That's the Woods story.
That's the Woods. That's like a vicious woman, really vicious story. Okay, and do you remember who wrote Sideshow? It's like I'm so bad. I mean, I'll remember. I mixed up my writers a few times, so yeah, that's how that came about. And I think you probably want us to stop. I mean, if not, really, we could go on forever. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
For talking to us.
Thank you guys so much.
And there it goes again.
That's fine.